Whether reason will prevail depends only partly upon us. We must hope and strive for the best. We must prepare for the worst.
Welcome to Clear the Truth. Today, our guest is Einat Wilf, a former Knesset member in Israel and a leading Israeli thinker. She is the author of numerous books, including The War of Return, How Western Indulgence of the Palestinian Dream Has Obstructed the Path to Peace. Before we dive into our interview, let's take a quick look at the news of today. Hurricane Aaron is pushing north, impacting places such as North Carolina, and Washington has sent signals on a tougher stance on transnational crime, with U.S. warships deploying off Venezuela to target cartel trafficking routes. In Washington, President Trump is also continuing his push for peace with Ukraine and Russia. With that, let's jump into our interview. Einat, thanks for joining us.
Thank you. Pleasure to be here.
So you wrote a book, The War of Return, which I'm holding here, How Western Indulgence of the Palestinian Dream Has Obstructed the Path to Peace. I want to start with a broad question. What do you mean by that? And how has it obstructed the path to peace?
Basically, the book makes one argument that the conflict has only ever been about one thing and one thing only, that the Palestine Arabs' top priority, as we bring a quote from the British foreign minister in 1947, is to prevent the establishment of a Jewish state in any part of the land between the Jordan River and the Mediterranean Sea. And as a result, the conflict, contrary to what people would love to believe, is a zero-sum game because, at least from the Palestinian Arab perspective, their ultimate goal around which they are organized is to ensure that the Jews have zero. What we argue in the book is that the West has actually fueled this idea, which in an updated version of the book we now name Palestinianism, the singular obsession and ideology which is singularly obsessed with the non-existence of a Jewish state, and that the West has fueled and funded it, mostly through an organization called UNRWA, and allowed essentially the Palestine Arabs to persist in their view, generation after generation, that one day they will win the war that they have been waging for the last century, almost century and a half, to ensure that the Jews have nothing.
Going back to the 70s, President Carter worked out a deal with the leaders of Egypt and of Israel. At the time, it seemed untenable that Israel would not give up a lot of the land that they ended up giving up. Could you not argue that it's similar now, that the politics have shifted a bit and that in some form or fashion there could be a Palestinian state alongside an Israeli state? Is there no world where there could be a state for Palestine?
There is no indication that there is any change in the Palestine Arab ethos of a complete rejection of a Jewish state. And the way that we test it is there are two very effective and incredibly reliable litmus tests. They are called perpetual refugeehood and the right of return, which is not a right or not a return. But just to say, when Palestine Arabs have said over the years that they support a two-state solution, some have, we and many in the West have made the crazy assumption that one of the two states is the Jewish state. But when they say two states, it's an Arab state in the West Bank and Gaza and another Arab state to replace Israel through this idea of refugee. Again, they're not refugees by any international standard, and return, which they have no right, which is the mechanism by which Israel becomes an Arab majority state. So actually, and in the book we show that, it's very powerful empirically that there is no moment in the last century, century and a half, where the Palestine Arabs have a vision of peace, where there is a Jewish state anywhere to be found. So when you talk about the Egyptian case, Egypt has an identity that is separate from its opposition to the existence of a Jewish state. It probably would like Israel to disappear, but Egypt can stand on its own in terms of a national identity. So you could at least cut a deal, which, by the way, it's important to remind people is a weird deal. It's actually very rare in history, it's unheard of, that the victor is the one that has to give land. Abba Eban, Israel's famed foreign ambassador to the UN and Minister of Foreign Affairs, said after the Six-Day War that this is the first case in history that the victors had to sue for peace and the losers, defeated, demanded unconditional surrender. By the way, a pattern which we see right now. With the Palestine Arabs, unlike the Egyptian Arabs, they do not have a collective identity that is not organized around the rejection of a Jewish state. There's some reasons for that, the way that the lands of the Ottoman empires have been divvied up. But essentially, if you take away Palestinianism, there is nothing that connects the Arabs of Gaza and the Arabs of the West Bank and millions of Arabs living in Jordan, Syria, and Lebanon, and that really separates them from Jordanian Arabs or Syrian Arabs or Lebanese Arabs. It is an ideology, which again in the book we show has been fueled and funded by the West for decades, that is singularly focused on destroying what the Jews have built rather than building for themselves. So if this is the ideology and there is exactly zero evidence that anything has changed in that, then the only path to a two-state solution, and this is where you said at the end, is there any world in which this is possible? And my answer is yes. The world in which this is possible is the world where the ideology of Palestinianism dies and is replaced by an ideology that I've come to call Arab Zionism, which sounds like a crazy idea, but it is merely the idea that Arabs and Muslims, based, by the way, on their texts and their histories, understand that the Jews are merely a tribe of the region and that the state of Israel is simply the modern expression of the historic and uninterrupted connection of the people of Israel with the land of Israel. Once the Palestine Arabs decide that they want a state next to a Jewish state, which I call Arab Zionism, then it's possible. But right now, we cannot want for them what they've never wanted for themselves.
Well, I think a lot of folks would sort of talk about the changing leadership with Arab leaders right now. Mahmoud Abbas, of course, has been in charge for some time within Palestine, and he's not shown much willingness to moderate. But you have Mohammed bin Salman in Saudi Arabia, who has actively been more surprisingly progressive despite his murder of Jamal Khashoggi. Obviously, you have the Abraham Accords in 2020. Do you think that the new generation of Muslim and Arab leaders could make this worldview possible?
Certainly. This is where the hope lies. And it's an important hope because the people of Israel being in the land of Israel, if you combine that with the fact that the 7th century Arab conquests of the Levant and North Africa have been hugely successful, mean that as long as the Jews want to be sovereign, and Jewish sovereignty is only in the land of Israel, it means that they are damned or destined to remain an ethnic, linguistic, religious, and national Jewish minority in an overwhelming Arab and Islamic Middle East. So the only true path to peace, even if you just think about it logically, is if the overwhelming majority, the Arab Islamic majority, looks at the Jews in the land of Israel not as foreigners. All the names, white, European, settler, colonialists, they're merely synonyms to say, you're foreigners, get out. Once the Jews are embraced as a people of the region and the state of Israel as the modern political expression, then you can have true peace. And indeed, the developments in the Gulf with the leadership in Saudi, in the UAE, with the Abraham Accords, shows the future direction. After the Abraham Accords were signed, I co-wrote an op-ed with 2 young Emiratis, a man and a woman. You spoke about the next generation. They were young. And the op-ed opens with the following phrases. were proud Muslims, were proud Arabs, and were Zionists. That's how they described themselves, and they were not shying away from the word. And they basically described the older generations as having wasted so many resources, and the most valuable one, the resource of time, around this obsession with the non-existence of a Jewish state. And they were like, enough. And what they also added is they said there's no contradiction between a proud Arab and Muslim identity. That's what I said. Arabs and Muslims have a civilizational content that is not dependent on being anti-Zionists, on rejecting Jewish sovereignty. It's a rich civilization that can stand on its own. So yes, you can have a vision of Arab Zionism, essentially a proud Arab and Muslim identity that through the Arab and Islamic texts and traditions and knowledge of history embraces the state of Israel as the modern expression of the historical connection of the people of Israel with the land of Israel. And this is the vision of peace that I speak about and promote. I sometimes joke that I'm a long-term peace activist. I say that for many years. I'm working on a book in Hebrew now that will have the lovely title of Peace Not Now. And the argument is that we've spent and basically wasted decades on shortcuts, direct negotiations. Okay, if it's not Arafat and Abu Mazen, if neither of them will sign, let's just get out of Gaza. All kinds of things that are essentially shortcuts, attempts to achieve peace now. And my argument is that we need a process of the transformation of the ideology of the Arabs of Gaza and the West Bank and those in Jordan, Syria, and Lebanon from Palestinianism, from this singular obsession with the destruction of the Jewish state, to Arab Zionism, to a proud Arab and Muslim identity that can live next to a Jewish state rather than seeking to erase it. And certainly the countries in the Gulf and the leaders show the way.
I don't think there's anyone who would argue that October 7th, the attacks on October 7th, 2023 should not have been responded to. But I think if you ask people who I talk to, normal mainstream Americans, many people, and I'm not saying I hold this view, but I know many people hold the view that Israel has, for lack of better words, over-responded. What credence do you give to the argument that Israel's response in Gaza has made this possibility harder, that it's emboldened hardliners in Palestine, it's emboldened more of the radicals within Hamas, when it seemed like there was a moment when progress was being moved forward? As we were talking about the Abraham Accords, it seemed that Israel's response to many has driven them further to the right and made long-term peace even more hard.
So I'll take the two separate arguments. Has Israel over-responded? I have repeatedly argued, and this might sound odd, that Israel has under-responded, and it's not about kind of the bombs and all that. What I think Israel's greatest mistakes in the conduct of this war is the first is badly defining the enemy. And when you badly define the enemy, your war is a mess. The enemy is not Hamas. It's a comforting myth, but the enemy, Hamas, is merely the executive arm of the ideology of Palestinianism. There is no opposition to that idea anywhere across Palestinian Arab society. Hamas is merely the most lethal and recent executors of that ideology. So I would have liked an Israeli leadership that after October 7th, I will say if that's the leadership we would have not had October 7th, because they would have understood that we have a bigger enemy than just one single organization. Israel should have said, we are going to war at the minimum against Gaza. We know that when the people of Gaza thought that their executive arm was successful, they were elated. You saw euphoria, and the euphoria was everywhere. And it was not because some breaking out of prison, we know that lie was immediately revealed, because they finally saw their dream. We talked about the dream that was indulged, the dream of no Jewish state. They saw through the GoPro cameras. So sometimes people say, oh, what, you killed them all? And I'm like, which history books have you been reading? When war was waged on Nazi Germany, on Imperial Japan, the war is waged in a collective. Roosevelt in December 1941 did not declare war on Japanese pilots. He did not say, Japan, we're cool with everything. We're just going to go in, find the pilots, kill the pilots, and we're out. The idea was that the war is waged collectively, surrender is made collectively, peace is made collectively. People seem to forget that. So I think we made a terrible error, which again, I think people made the mistake of thinking that it's more PR-y easy to say that the war is against Hamas rather than against Gaza, or to bring the ideology of Palestinianism to an end. But that's what I think our leadership should have said. On October 7th, we should have said, we begin a war, which we should have started a long time ago, to bring the ideology of Palestinianism to an end. As long as this is the ideology that connects the Arabs of Gaza and the West Bank and millions in Syria, Lebanon, and Jordan, there will never be peace. And just like in Europe, just like in Asia, the ideology that is at the core of all the wars, like Nazi Germany, like Imperial Japan, like Palestinianism, has to die. So in that sense, I think we underwent to war, and that's why it's so difficult. You can't win a war that is based on a lie. We also did other things. Once we told that lie, we caved in to the notion that we need to supply our enemy at a time of war. Again, insane. In what war is it expected that you supply your enemy as they refuse to surrender, they fight you, they hold your hostages? And this is somehow not only assumed as expected, it's if Israel fails to do so, it's somehow going against these absolutely invented rules. I always remind people that international law for war was not written by pacifists. It was written by people who understood that wars need to be waged and won. And, everyone who understood war understood that if you're supplying your enemy, the war is never going to be over. And the law says you need to enable people to supply, sure, only women and children, and only if you know that it doesn't give the enemy an advantage, which we know it does. So the amazing thing is Israel has exactly zero responsibility, and yet so many people pretend that it does. And also, I think we fail to call out Egypt and certainly Qatar on their terrible double game throughout. So I think actually in that respect, Israel undermanaged the war. When it comes to the hostages, we caved in too soon, in my view, on the fact that you negotiate for them. Like, we've completely accepted that the Palestinians invaded Israel, kidnapped people from their beds on a Shabbat morning, elderly women, children, families, and that now it's a negotiating situation. We should have been at that moment making it clearly that we're going crazy. And again, not in terms of bombing. People in Israel tell me, Einat, the Biden administration would not supply us if we would have cut off everything from Gaza until the hostages return. I think that would have been a very powerful message on day one. From our side, Egypt is welcome to supply them. They clearly supplied them before October 7th. But from our side, from the lies through which we were invaded, we're not supplying the enemy, and nothing goes in until every last hostage comes back. And people said, well, we would have gotten no bombs. I said, fine, don't bomb anyone, but make it very clear that nothing goes in until every single last hostage comes out. Make it clear that the Hashemite regime in Jordan and Egypt, no one is going to be safe. We're going to go crazy unless all the hostages are returned. And again, instead, we agreed to this kind of slow-moving negotiations that has only served to keep the enemy in power. So I think, actually, to the extent that people... Okay, so now this is my view about the conduct of the war. But in terms of whether this is what's turning people away, as someone who has studied the rise of anti-Zionism, and especially the thing that I've come to call the placard strategy, because you see it in anti-Israel placards, these equations that equate Israel and Zionism and the Star of David with every evil word. I've carefully followed the effort to blame Israel for genocide for at least 15 years. So what we saw on October 8th, it was beautifully said by Hussein Abu Bakr Mansour, this eruption around the world and in the West, he called it a symbolic participation in the October 7th massacre. So rather than a response to the Israeli response, it was actually an enthusiastic, euphoric participation in the massacre. Through the actions on American campuses and in the media. Now, I actually think so there is this group, and that's a group that clearly what they saw on October 7th was not what Israel did, what they saw what can be achieved. They were thrilled and elated by the possibility of a vision of a world without Israel. Those who are frustrated with Israel's conduct with the war, here is where I do blame ourselves. But again, I blame us for failing to draw a very clear line that says we have exactly zero responsibility to supply our enemy at a time of war. Get them to surrender and the war is over. But we play into that. So then people are like, oh, so you're not supplying them this way, but you're supplying them. Rather than being very clear, it is not our responsibility. It's insane that you even expect it to be our responsibility.
You served in the Israeli government. Do you think that Israel would have been in a better place to sort of win this PR argument and to win the war if a different leader other than Netanyahu was in charge?
Of course, but different.
I mean, he also, going into the war, right? He was being indicted for corruption. There were judicial reforms, mass protest. Not a popular leader.
Those are not the things that really, I mean, it matters on other levels, the kind of the gutting of the Israeli state and the public service, which led to Israel's inability to properly prepare and respond. Mm-hmm. But I see it as a much deeper issue, and I think it's an issue that still plagues him. He refuses to accept that the Palestinians are a worthy enemy. I don't know if an issue of ego, Iran is on his level, but the Palestine Arabs are not. But again, because I followed it for years, the book in Israel came out in 2018. Adi Schwartz, the co-writer, and me would have numerous meetings with the Israeli government telling them nothing good is being built in Gaza. You cannot purchase quiet with the billions that you're allowing to be pumped in. Those are going to be used to attack us because that's their ideology. The people of Gaza, all of them, do not see Gaza as their home. They see Gaza as the launchpad from which to achieve the ultimate goal of no Jewish state. So nothing good can come from pumping billions into it. And there is this notion that the Palestinian Arabs are some toddlers that can be bought with money. It's also this Western notion of they just want a better life, for years when I gave the talk about the conflict and what the Palestine Arabs want, people, especially Americans, would say, but don't they want a better future for their children? And I would tell them, of course they want a better future for their children. The better future is the one where there's no Jewish state. For that better future, they're willing to sacrifice, they're willing to fight, but somehow people don't give them the respect of taking them at their word. One of the things that Dee and I are most proud of the book, that the book gives the Palestine Arabs the respect of taking them at their word. And I think this is something that Netanyahu is unable to do. If he had been able to do that before October 7th, we would not have the massacre, because he would not have thought that you can pump billions into Gaza and to think that this will appease them, this will mollify them. And even after, I think to this day, he refuses to admit that he's been played. That Sinwar took the fact that he knew that he was being underestimated, and there's no, going back to Lao Tzu, there's no greater benefit to an attacking power than to be underestimated. And they are still being underestimated. Look, we are almost 2 years into this war, and Hamas has not budged one iota from their demand that the last hostage will be released, when essentially they return to the conditions before the massacre. They control Gaza, the territory is within their control, and the billions go back to flowing in. They've been able to play the PR war much better. They understood that the war is much more than tunnels. It's about, again, playing into the placard strategy, playing into the fact that people do want in so many places to believe the worst about the collective Jew. There's almost a certain physical pleasure in that. So yes, I think someone who would have been willing to give the Palestine Arabs the respect of taking them as a worthy, dedicated, sophisticated enemy, I think would have prevented it to begin with, but also would have not led us to a position where nearly 2 years later, we're stuck.
Well, right now, when someone thinks about the conflict, I think most people see images of starving children in Gaza. Do you worry that the perception of a famine, starvation, not my words, but others, a genocide in Gaza right now are undermining Israel's ability to finish the war?
First of all, of course, that is why they're being done. Again, as someone who's followed this placard strategy for 2 decades now, at least, I always told people will be like, Einat, it's like, these are just words, apartheid, genocide. And again, genocide has been around for at least 15 years. They've always tried to push it to the mainstream. Like, these words, they're just words, that doesn't matter. And I would always tell them they are the most important things, because words, ideas determine action. Nothing ever moves if people don't believe that it should move. So, this is also how sometimes people say, even in Israel, oh, there's Hamas, the extremists, they're the Palestinian Authority, like the moderates. I'm like, no. The PA, the people of the West Bank, share the same Palestinian vision of no Jewish state. They just believe that they have a better chance of achieving it by essentially encircling Israel globally and turning it into a pariah state, which will limit its ability to defend itself. And that's how you bring the end of the Jewish state. But I'm like, there's no Palestinian vision where the Jewish state gets to live. Their only argument is over the means, the tactics, but there's no argument about the goal and the vision. So, of course, the whole idea of pushing the genocide libel, the famine libel, they're all intended to prevent Israel's ability to defend itself. And I will say it's effective because Israeli leaders, and again, I think it's also because our leaders fail again to appreciate how sophisticated and dedicated and sinister is the enemy. They don't understand that the fact that Israel is now supplying its enemy is the direct outcome of this global campaign that somehow makes it normal that Israel has to supply its enemy. I find that so much of my work in the last 2 years, even before that, is to tell people, this is insane. This is insane. This is also insane. And this is also insane. It's insane to supply your enemy at a time of war. It's insane to pump billions to an ideology that wants you gone. It's insane to look at a hostage situation and immediately accept that it's a negotiating situation. We are working through insanity. And yes, a lot of the success of the libels of genocide and famine are precisely to limit Israel's ability to conduct the war effectively.
To play devil's advocate, though, and then I would like to shift to Iran if I could, and I say this with utmost respect, but It does appear, I think, to at least 90% of most folks not in Israel or not in Palestine, that there are children starving. Do you think that they should be allowed aid directly even while the war is being conducted, just so these innocent children do not die?
The question is who is responsible? Who is responsible? Again, one thing is for sure. Between the libelous campaign and the actual situation on the ground, there's no connection. Is there in a war situation where people need to move, where some places are places of war? Are some people, not all the time, but are some people starving? Certainly. Who is responsible? That's my argument. My argument is that once we agreed to pretend that Hamas, this is just a war against Hamas, rather than against Gaza, against Palestinianism, then you assume responsibility. And my criticism within Israel is we should have held the line from day one, not our responsibility. To the extent that there is starvation, go to the address and call on the Palestinians to surrender, to unconditionally release the hostage. The problem is not the issue of whether some people are starving. The question is, where do you put the responsibility? Where do you put the cause and effect? And that's what I'm saying is the insane element. The people put the responsibility on Israel, whereas even law is on our side. As I said, it wasn't written by pacifists. We are under no responsibility. Our only responsibility is to enable, certainly not to do it ourselves, to enable others who want to do so to supply, only to women and children under 15, and only if it does not provide the enemy with an advantage. So in a normal, not an upside down world, the message would have gone from day one to the Palestinians: surrender. Surrender, surrender, release the hostages unconditionally. You are held responsible until that is what you do. And again, people used to understand that this is how wars are waged. They're waged on a collective level, and the responsibility is collective.
I want to respect your time, but do you have a minute to shift a bit to Iran?
Sure.
So, look, I think any sober-minded analyst would point to the conflict with Iran as what's really undergirding the entire current conflict and what is really the long-term conflict to be had still. Do you think that the Middle East is safer today after the U.S. strikes on Iran a few months ago, and how will that impact the current conflict with Gaza and the Palestinians?
So I'll separate the U.S. and Israel. First of all, I actually challenge the assumption that the problem is Iran. Because I believe the true enemy, and certainly from the Israeli perspective, not from the American perspective, the true enemy is the Palestine Arabs. If you look at the history, because the Palestine Arabs have been singularly focused on the non-existence of a Jewish state, they always received the support of every anti-Jewish and anti-Zionist power in history. It was the Nazis in the 30s and 40s. In many ways, we're still paying for the fact that the Arab world was not denazified, that the Palestine Arabs were not denazified, that Hajj Amin al-Husseini actually was able to escape the Nuremberg trials. You know, people speak of Hamas as the Muslim Brotherhood. You read the Hamas charter, 50-50, Nazi propaganda, Muslim Brotherhood. Then the Nazis are replaced by the Soviets, who insert this whole idea of anti-Zionism as the respectable mask for anti-Semitism and use Palestinianism inserted into the global international organizations. Then the Soviet Union is replaced by Iran. I forgot to mention the Pan-Arabists in the 50s and 60s. Now you'll notice there's a thread here. All the supporters of Palestinianism for the last century have found themselves in the dustbin of history. Now, I'm not making a theological argument like Domus with the Jews. The argument is that if you are a nation focused on destruction, you tend to gravitate to supporting an ideology of destruction, but ultimately you have nothing to offer your people and you collapse. So why the Iranians, looking at the history, choose to follow this path. And now we see Qatar and Turkey rushing to fill the void. I think ultimately the Ayatollah regime will fall. If you look at the history of the supporters of Palestinianism. So that's for Israel. So is Israel temporarily safer with the attack on Iran? Maybe, but genuinely, I don't really think where the issue is. Look, the Soviet Union fell, the Pan-Arabists were defeated, and the Palestinians always found new anti-Semitic, anti-Zionist supporters. That's what concerns me much more. America is in a different position. I remember when, America ultimately enjoys the benefit of geography, separated from the world by two oceans, Canada to the north, Mexico to the south. Seriously, I remember when President Obama said he was going to pivot to Asia. And I remember thinking, sure, America can pivot to Asia. We can't. We're stuck, right? This goes back. As long as the Jews want to be sovereign, it's in the land of Israel. The land of Israel is in the midst of the Arab and Islamic region. So for us, I think we need to ultimately address the ideology of Palestinianism. We can always get temporary reprieve. When the Soviet Union fell, clearly there were a lot of benefits. But if we do not address the ideology at our doorstep, that's always going to be the threat to us.
So, how does the current conflict, the one that's driving the news today, tomorrow, and for the next probably year or so, how does that end? And then how do we get to a long-term peace with Palestine and Israel?
So the
And is
two
it possible
are
at all?
okay. So the two are intimately related. About a few months ago, I was in a conference in Paris. It was about how to make peace. And again, it's a few months ago. It's after October 7th. And I'm sure you've seen the movie Back to the Future. You remember the scenes where Marty begins to understand that he's in the 50s, right? He goes into a diner, he sees a newspaper, it begins to dawn on him that he's in the 50s. I go into this conference, I'm at this panel, it's all about the two-state solution. How do we go back to the negotiating table? How can we get soon to the negotiating table? And it slowly dawns on me that we're in the 90s. Like nothing's changed. And at one point in the panel, the European moderator asks me, how can Europe help? And I don't know what your experience is, but often when European diplomats, journalists ask this question, it's with this smug notion of how can we, enlightened, peace-loving people, help you savages solve your issues?
Real quick, can I just say, I think we are all annoyed with the French often.
General. So I'm sitting there and I'm like, I can tell you what would really help us. I told her, what would really help us if the EU actually remembered how it became the EU. They just celebrated the Victory Day. I was like, you did not become the EU because you were peace-loving, enlightened people who sat around a negotiating table and kind of solved your differences. You became the EU because you had a few ruthless leaders who understood that World War II, unlike World War I, cannot end with a fuzzy armistice, where Germany will then say that the victory was stolen. This time, Nazi Germany, Imperial Japan, and all their allies, except the Italians, who are always good at flipping at the last moment, everyone will know that they lost. And they will pay with territory, with displacement, with reparations. There will be no question this time as to who lost. There will be unconditional surrender and pay a hefty price to understand that you lost. We recently actually saw an amazing indication of that when the German chancellor was in President Trump's office. And I think it was the day, May 8th, of victory over Nazi Germany. They mentioned that and kind of President Trump joked to the German chancellor, not a good day for you. And the German chancellor responded with, it was an important day that began the new Germany, or something like that. And that's what I told them, the Europeans. I told them, that's what I want for my people. what you have here. I want there to be a clear understanding that Palestinianism as an ideology has lost, that it's illegitimate, that it has only brought ruin to its people by going repeatedly to terrible wars of destruction, and that the only path to peace is when this ideology of destruction of Palestinianism is replaced with an ideology of construction of Arab Zionism. Now, one of my greatest fears is that given everything we talked about, the possibility of clear victory, where the losing side actually understands that they lost and acknowledge that they lost, because acknowledging defeat, I used a book about Japan, embracing defeat. Embracing defeat is actually the key to transformation. And if we really want peace, not just, I sometimes talk about the difference between doing good and feeling good. Those ruthless leaders actually did good, but it wasn't, lovey-dovey stuff. To actually do good, Palestinianism needs to be so badly defeated in this war and understand that it's been defeated and embrace that it's been defeated so that we can begin a process of transformation. If that's not going to happen, then we're stuck. Because, sometimes people, apropos savages, treat this conflict as if it's a cycle of violence. And I'm like, no. It's a very logical sort of violence. If every time the Palestine Arabs go to a war of annihilation, and there's never been any kind of war, unfortunately, and every time they lose, they are salvaged from their loss by indulgent Westerners who tell them, no, you haven't lost. You don't have to accept defeat. You don't have to embrace defeat. We'll keep funding you. We're going to there's nothing wrong with the ideology. If every time they get the message, you haven't lost, your victory is merely around the corner, the day of victory over the Jewish state will arrive, try again. They do what any logical people would do. They try again. And that's what I fear.
So, in your view, sort of to close here, the key to long-term peace is a clear loss by the Palestinians?
Yes. A loss which they connect to their ideology, where they begin to understand that their ideology has brought them to ruin.
Do you think that this could happen in the relatively near future?
Again, the reason I fear it, I think a lot of Israelis instinctively understand it, that we won't be able to survive, literally survive, if that's not going to be how the war ends. But the pressures that are being brought for Israel to not win this war, and certainly for Palestinianism not to be defeated, are incredibly powerful. So these are my fears, these are my hopes, but the only hope of true peace is for Palestinianism to be defeated and for the Palestine Arabs, like the German chancellor, to one day look at it and say, yes, us being defeated was good because it began a process of necessary transformation away from a terrible ideology of destruction into one where we build for ourselves rather than focus on destroying what the Jews have built.
Wonderful. Well, Einat, I have taken about 45 minutes of your time. This has been a wonderful conversation. For our listeners, where can they follow your work?
I have the books like The War of Return and books like We Should All Be Zionists and The War of Words. And I'm very active on Twitter and LinkedIn and a bit on Instagram. That's mostly where I am. And of course,
Wonderful.
There's plenty of YouTube lectures and videos.
Thanks again for joining us for this episode of Clearer Than Truth. Be sure to tune in next time.